Oliver, excited to chat planning with you today. I guess maybe to start, why are you so interested in this topic?
Maybe it's because I'm German, but joking aside, I remember when I was a student, I was reading Andy Grove's High Output Management book. For some weird reason, it just more or less randomly picked it up in a bookshop and read it and was really fascinated by it. And then many years later, when I worked at Google and did my OKRs at Google, yeah, I kind of learned on, oh, actually that book was the predecessor of the OKR system we were using at Google. So predated that by a lot.
I've heard you talk a lot about planning in the past, and we have obviously worked really closely on planning at Coda. I guess generally the question I hear a lot is how much time should teams spend on planning? And I know that you have a golden rule that we try to follow. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so my golden rule is to not spend more than 10% of your time planning, which is very extreme because most companies, if you ask them and if you try to measure it, they spend about 25 to 30% of their time planning and the rest of the time executing. And so the goal of the golden rule is to trim that time down from 25 or 30%, try to get to 10%. And this is not to devalue the value of planning itself, but to basically stress the relative importance of execution over planning, but also to combat the misconception that longer planning is better planning. Often shorter planning leads to actually better plans.
So if someone's listening and they're like, how do you actually do that? So our planning cycle may be more like 20, 30% of the time. How do you get it down to 10%? Do you have any tips for them?
Yeah, there's basically three areas that you need to tackle. The most important one is focus. If you think about it, if planning tracks out over multiple weeks, you inevitably have everybody do their normal day job and do planning as a side job, which is lack of focus. You're also creating what I call the planning vacuum, which is, well, the team are still formally executing the old plan, but leadership and the most senior people in the company are all now focused on drafting the new plan and are no longer focused on executing the old one. And that tracks out over multiple weeks, creating this vacuum, which is another form of lack of focus. If you trim down planning, you can be focused the entire time. Planning can be the only thing that you do if planning only lasts a few days. So focus is number one. Number two is improve the planning process. And the third thing is use the right tools and use really, really good tools so that you can further trim down planning.
Actually, maybe a good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is you're kind of alluding to leadership and the team's actually doing a lot of the work. Can you just describe M-shaped planning and maybe describe the phases of M-shaped planning?
Yeah, so good planning process is M-shaped, like you said, with the y-axis basically of planning describing whether information is flowing upwards from like teams to leadership or downwards from leadership or executives down to the teams. The M-shaped planning process starts with reflection, which is basically looking back at the previous planning period and summarizing that, and in particular drawing the learnings from what worked well and what has to change. Next phase, now we're basically on the downward slope of the M, is the top-down guidance, where leadership provides guidance to the teams. And this is followed by the bottom-up planning phase, which is the most critical and also typically the most time-consuming of all the phases. And that is when teams are drafting their plans or drafting their OKRs. And the last step to complete the M is a step that is often actually neglected, but it's an absolutely critical step. I call it the integration phase for lack of a better term. And that is when leadership again steps in, looks across all these bottom-up plans that have been drafted, and is doing a number of things. It's resolving all the outstanding issues and questions. It's ensuring that the teams are particularly not overcommitted at this point in times, and that any resourcing conflicts that have come up as part of planning are being efficiently resolved.
What does top-down guidance actually look like? What are the sort of phases of that?
So there are three important aspects of top-down guidance. The first thing is timing. Top-down guidance has to happen early in the planning process, and in particular, before bottom-up planning happens. The second part is hitting the right level of granularity with the top-down guidance. Principle here is provide direction, but not details. The details will be added by the teams who are all into the details during the bottom-up planning phase, the priority of top-down guidance, just to point people in the right direction. The third aspect is to communicate it effectively. And that means that top-down guidance is an integral part of the resulting plan. If it gets communicated in a meeting and isn't written down, or it's a series of emails that nobody can find a few days later, that's very ineffective top-down guidance. It should be written down. It should be easy to find a day later, a week later, a month later, 3 months later.
Yeah, that resonates. It actually reminds me of something that I think we both worked with Claire Hughes Johnson at Google, and she used to say teams need to know the rules of the game and how to win. And I felt like that was always my mindset, or that is my mindset for top-down guidance, like provide enough constraint that it's clear what the rules of the game are, and then, how they can succeed. So,
yeah, and then they can go and run.
Right. Okay, cool. Tell me more about what's so important about the integration phase. Why is that critical?
Yeah, so the integration phase follows the bottom-up planning phase. At that point in time, typically some teams will have overcommitted themselves for various reasons. They underestimate the complexity of tasks, or they have just been asked to support so many seemingly critical tasks that other teams have. If we don't resolve basically the overcommitment of those teams, either by adding more resourcing or by reducing the number of tasks or by doing any other kind of change that leadership can enact, basically their plan is basically completely unachievable from day one. The second aspect is that some teams might have drifted from the top-down guidance or interpreted slightly differently in different departments. And now they might be moving in the same direction together, but they're not in lockstep. And the third thing is just there will be a lot of open questions, smaller and bigger decisions that have to be made and clarified. And that would be good to resolve before execution starts. So that's the three aspects of the integration phase.
You've thought a lot about this topic of planning. What's the most important part of planning?
Yeah, if you think about it, the most important part of planning is executing the plan. The best plan, the best planning process, the best top-down guidance, the best bottom planning. All of that doesn't matter if you can't execute the plan. The plan is completely worthless if it lacks the execution of it. If you think further about it and think about the value of companies, and we're both here in Silicon Valley, there's many companies that are not great at planning, but fantastic at execution, and they still have good valuation, versus companies that are great at planning, but can't execute anything. They're worth nothing.
Yeah, very well said. I like that. So what's the biggest mistake that you see people make in designing their planning process or just generally in their planning process?
Yeah, the most common mistake that people make, and it's an intuitive mistake to make, but still a mistake, is that they think they're unhappy with the quality of their planning process. So their intuition guides them toward, okay, let's just add another week or so of planning time to it in the hope that that will make it better. This can be counterproductive, adding more time to it. A, it takes away time from executing the plan. B, it also creates this additional planning or longer planning vacuum where the old plans, we're no longer focused on the old plans, we're not really ready with the new plans. And also there's a backlog of other work that people have to do. So they'll, like if you add a week, they'll not be spending that entire week planning. They'll be spending a few hours that week on planning. If you want to improve planning, what you actually have to improve is focus, tools, and process. That's the three aspects you tune.
Yeah, that resonates. And one of the other things that it reminds me of is just that when you're executing these plans, you learn new things, right? And so plans often change. So if you have a really long planning cycle where you try to plan everything perfectly, it's often, 2, 3, 4 weeks later that you learn something new and your plans have to change a little bit.
Yeah, if you're adding time because you're trying to predict the future more, there's very quickly very diminishing returns. Might often be better to just start going and be flexible in adjusting the plan. Yeah. So add that additional week of planning halfway through to adjust the plan, but not in trying to predict an uncertain future.
Yeah, 100%. What's a common misconception around OKR planning, or you've watched a bunch of companies up close around doing their OKR planning? What's one of those misconceptions that you see?
Yeah, the one big misconception is that there's a one size fits all, or that people basically try to copy OKR, let's say from Google. Google is the company OKRs became famous through. And And there's many companies here that have people coming from Google, so they basically try to implement OKRs exactly as Google did, and then they're surprised that it doesn't work well in their team, in their organization, in their company. Planning process and an OKR process has to be adjusted to the very specific and timely needs that the company or the organization is in. And that's very likely different for all the companies that are different than Google. So copying that same process and thinking it will yield the same results is just not going to work.
Yeah, that resonates. Even at Coda, just the pre, product market fit early years of planning were just so different than, 8 years later.
Yeah.
Just like a much more robust planning cycle, but also, to your point and your golden rule, short and get us to execution as well.
Yeah. And we have to regularly still adjust it. Like it's like different every 6 months, major changes being made every year.
All right. So let's talk about the most painful planning cycle that you've ever been through. We talked a little bit about mistakes, but I'd love to just hear what was a painful planning cycle that you've been through.
When in my time at Google, I remember when I worked in ads, going through a planning cycle where we did very detail-oriented and extremely time-consuming bottom-up planning, came up with a great plan, communicated the plan upwards with the revenue target that we were working towards, to then hear back that it's insufficient and we have to work against a much higher revenue planning, which forced us back into bottom-up planning for a second time, which was very draining. And to then come back to match that number, to then be very late asked to add an additional $1 billion to the number. And that was very painful because of all the time and effort wasted in the organization. But it was also very damaging because a year later, I had basically my leads and everybody expecting that that might happen again, and therefore hold back in the initial bottom-up planning. So it cost us like long-term damage as part of that.
It seems like that would be solved by one of the things that you talked about earlier, which is just good top-down guidance, right? It seems like in this case, that wasn't present. Is that right?
Yeah.
And what about, to contrast that, your most painful, what about your best planning experience?
The one that I still smile that makes me very happy is when we actually shortened the planning time at Coda in half. Because to be honest, I wasn't sure if it would really work or not. So there was a bit of a risk there. But we just brutally cut it down from 2 weeks into 1. And I was a bit nervous. But then basically throughout that 1 week of planning that we did, energy was so high. It was very clear that it was working actually really well. Teams were much more focused on planning than before. We ran a survey afterwards, which got fantastic results. Almost nobody objecting to keeping it that short. Everybody felt that this was the right direction. And also 3 months later, when we were finished with that quarter and working on the next plan, we can look back at metrics of that plan, and it was measurably better quality than the plans before. And also, we got an additional week for execution. So we also got 1 week more, that the engineering team could build features, which is amazing as well.
Yeah, I think having participated in that planning cycle, I think one thing that I would just re-up from what you said earlier is this idea that everybody's focused on planning. It's like the leadership team's focused on planning and all the different teams are focused on planning. And so there's a real, almost like solidarity or unity in the fact that everybody's in this mindset. And it is very intense, but like you said, you get back on the other side a whole nother week of execution, which is like, I think everybody's happy to not be in planning in that week, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So one topic that I hear from leaders a lot is how do you make sure that teams are accountable to plans that they make? And so I'd love to just hear any tips that you have on how to make employees, teams, ICs, everybody accountable to the plan that they make.
Yeah, I hear this a lot as well. It comes one of the top questions that come up. The one thing is to actually start with, have the priorities be really, really clear. Good top-down guidance does that, but then also have the bottom-up planning, basically write down the OKRs in a really good way and present the overall plan really well. That presentation of the plan at the end is important. People can't read the OKR table and fully understand what it means. The brain doesn't work that well. for understanding that. So good presentation at the end is critical for teams to understand the plan, and without understanding the plan, there can be no accountability towards the plan. And then the next thing is also clear responsibilities. Everybody's typically pretty clear in their planning of which team is responsible for this part of the plan. So that's often a given. Yeah, but that's often not sufficient. There's also supporting teams that need to support the plan. That needs to be entirely clear as well. Then, in my opinion, it's super important that every OKR has I call either the DRI, or internally we call it the driver. Both start with the letters DRI. That's the directly responsible individual. It can only be one person. That's important, because if it's more than one person, again, might feel, oh, the other people that are responsible for this will take this. It's only one person, and possibly an additional sponsor, an additional person in a leadership position that's higher up the chain, who can basically be the first escalation point if anything in that OKR goes wrong. And because it's a sponsor of the OKR, that person has the context for the OKR. And another tip to drive accountability is also to track progress continuously. And that's only one side. You need to track it from the teams that are executing on it, but also then a responsibility on the leadership side to actually look at that progress and pay attention to it with equal frequency. And that's, by the way, also often a tooling issue. Like, obviously, tracking it continuously is better than tracking it only once a quarter. But if the process and the tooling makes it really hard to track the progress, then many companies can only afford to do it once a quarter. But if you fix the tooling, then, well, you kind of get continuous tracking, because it's now been much easier, much cheaper.
Yeah. And build it into the initial process, right? Like, I think that's something that you've done really well here is build it into the way that we do OKRs completely, so that it's easy to pull into whatever place that we want to pull those OKRs in to get an update.
They can follow you along. Like, I have my one-to-one docs, and each of the one-to-one docs has the OKRs of the person and the team the person is in. So they're kind of there. I don't have to go to a different tool to look at their OKRs, which I might not do in a one-to-one environment, but because they're right there in the one-to-one doc, it's an easy step to go through them if there's time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, bringing in context to a meeting or to a one-on-one or something like that, bringing those OKRs. Yeah. What about if I'm a leader and I'm thinking about, like, what's the first thing that I could go do to improve my planning process? Like, I want to get started, not really sure where to start. It's a big topic. What's like the first thing that you recommend?
Be precise in what the actual problems are that you're trying to fix. Like, try to be as precise as possible to that. Any planning process you can look at, even the really good ones, there will be many problems. Yeah. But kind of try to get to the core problems. And then the question becomes, okay, do you do incremental improvements or an entire overhaul of the system? An entire overhaul of the system can be like a daunting task and can be dangerous if basically people have to change 20 things at the same time. Incremental improvements can be the better way to go, like focus on one or two problems, tackle them for one quarter, repeat them in another quarter, and then take the next 1 to 2 problems. That typically works better. If you do that, I would recommend focus on the tooling initially. Don't try to change everything in one go, but try to get the better tooling in place early on, because everything builds on tooling. And if the tooling slows you down with all the other tasks, you're just making future changes unnecessarily hard.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that we see a lot in companies is just OKRs and spreadsheets. Usually it's some like network of spreadsheets that are sometimes related, and sometimes there's a lot of copy and pasting happening. I guess, what do you think about planning OKRs in spreadsheets?
The first thing is to acknowledge that spreadsheets are by far the most common tool used for planning and for OKRs in the world. It's probably bigger than everything else together. And even when there is a dedicated planning tool, like in my time at Google, we had an internal build tool, which was called Easy OKRs. Many of my teams, not all of them, but many of my teams would still plan in a spreadsheet. And then some poor TPM would copy it from the spreadsheet into Easy OKRs the night before the review. So now spreadsheets have one advantage over the rigid tools like Easy OKRs and so on. And that is basically they're flexible. So teams can customize them to their specific needs. And that flexibility is important. Teams really need that, or at least they think that they need that. The disadvantage, however, is like spreadsheets just don't scale. They don't scale across multiple teams. They fall apart easily. They're often fragile. If you want to do something like dependency tracking, which we discussed earlier, it's very hard and next to impossible to do in a spreadsheet. How do you deal with if you have 100 teams and therefore 100 spreadsheets and reconcile them? Spreadsheets are also horrible instruments to store like the top-down guidance. So you then typically have links from those spreadsheets to documents that might not have the permission set for everybody who has access to the spreadsheet to also read them, which means people can't actually read the full plan, but only fragments of it. It just quickly runs into scaling issues when then better tools that preserve the flexibility of a spreadsheet, but add all the additional functionality and avoid all the scaling issues of spreadsheets. My opinion is Coda is the best of both worlds because we've built it with that in mind.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, spreadsheets weren't really built for things like OKRs, right? But like you said, it's the most common used tool for OKRs. And so you're constantly dealing with these little edges to that problem, whether it's like breaking formulas or people copying and pasting wrong or them not being networked together well. And that's in stark contrast to where Coda, we started with the idea of like people are going to want to track things like OKRs, right? And really built it from the ground up that way.
And then there's many secondary effects. Like in a Coda document, I can just render just my OKRs of just the person logged in. Yeah, that's super useful because even a company of 200 people will have a few hundred key results possibly. That can be a daunting table to navigate to find the two that you are responsible for. Yeah, but in a more flexible tool like Coda, you can just render a custom view for just a logged in person. Make that easier, make that friction go away as well.
One thing that we didn't touch on that I'd love to hear your take on is just how something like OKRs and Coda can lead naturally to execution, right? And like that kind of seamless nature of making the plan and then starting to execute the plan. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you actually look at some data, so most companies, if you look at their planning artifacts, it's like, I think the number is about 200. So their actual plan for one planning period is distributed among 200 emails, documents, presentations, spreadsheets. So we have on one side a plan that's fragmented, but lives in this document world. And then on the other side, the company uses, again, 250 typically or more, different tools, different software for execution, for the day-to-day execution, ranging from everything from GitHub to Salesforce and so on. Now, of course, not every function uses all 250 tools, yeah, but there's typically tens of tools used for execution. And now you have that big divide of a fragmented plan over many documents, and then execution fragmented over many different software pieces, which means you now have to cross the divide between them all the time. And that's just very intense. It's a big divide that you have to do, and it's potentially an n square problem because of the explosion here and the explosion here. So then obviously what you should do is you try to reconcile the plan into just a single document, and you reduce or at least integrate the different tools on the other side with each other, and then also have the plan actually move really close and into the execution environment, or what we typically call the team hub. Yeah, have the plan live in here as well by also preserving it in a central document. So you can get the best of both worlds by basically reducing the divide between planning and execution to move as close as you can.
Yeah, and I think there are like strange or unintuitive benefits to having those OKRs and that, the sort of plan right next to the execution. If you're an IC engineer, IC designer, and you're working on a task there or writing a PRD or something like that, and one click away in that left-hand navigation, you see the plan or you see the why behind the plan, you're just more likely to encounter it than if you were to go into a big spreadsheet that had 20 different links and it was just another tab in your browser, right? So I think there are some less intuitive but very important benefits of doing that.
And also, to be honest, for me, for the OKRs I sign up for, I need to be reminded of them regularly. I tend to focus on some of them all the time and then neglect others, which is a common failure pattern. You get so excited about some and you forget the others. But if they literally, because they live in the environment I'm currently working on, I'm permanently reminded of all of them. Makes it very unlikely I neglect a good chunk of them.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting planning with me today. Super fun.
Oh, thanks. Great questions, Lane.